I lose to one of my colleagues. And believe it or not, there's another one. There's one he actually makes a living on. Yeah, he's okay, that's just fun. That's just fun.
All right, everyone, so thank you all for coming to our Douglas Dialogues event, The Ethics of Taking a Job. So Declan's going to talk a little bit about the club. I'm going to introduce professors, and then we're going to get into a few questions that Declan and I have had with us. And then we're going to open the Q&A. We want the Q&A to take the majority of the time, so we might start at the 20 to 30 minute mark. So,
Awesome. Like Rahman said, my name is Declan. I'm Vice President of the Douglas Dialogues. I'm going to go over the mission of our club, and then Rahman, like you said, will go over the Q&A. The Douglas Dialogues aims to create a space for students of all political and philosophical backgrounds to discuss what they find to be pressing socio-cultural and political issues of the day. We advocate for and believe that open, honest dialogue regarding the different approaches and interpretations of these issues is the best way forward in making the world a better place. Our club is open to any Lehigh student. Our members aren't pre-selected by their political beliefs or majors, but only by their interests and curiosities in the affairs of the world. We meet bi-weekly to discuss topics our club members democratically decide to talk about. And if you'd like to be part of our club, just send me a message or shoot me an email at dmc223. Another big focus of our club is to invite speakers who are experts in topics we find pressing and may not know much about. We create a space where students can listen and are able to contend with those very ideas that academics have worked on or that experts know about. Today, we have our 9th speaker event, and so far, our speakers today will bring us to 14 independent speakers. So thank you for joining, and Rahman will give the intros.
yeah. So hello, everyone. My name is Rahman. I'm the president of Douglas Dialogues. So I'm just going to quickly introduce the professors. Professor Ahmed Rahman is a research fellow at the Institute of Labor Economics. His research areas include economic growth, economic history, immigration, and the economics of education. Some of his current work focuses on the effects of peer and teachers on college students' performance, the impacts of different experiences in military service and private sector employment, and the wage and employment effects of immigration on Native workers. Prior to joining the Lehigh faculty, Professor Rahman was an associate professor at the United States Naval Academy. Bill Best is a teaching professor in the Department of Mechanical Engineering and Mechanics and has teaching responsibilities in electrical and computer engineering. In addition, he serves as the co-director of the IDEA program. His undergraduate work was in mechanical engineering at Tufts University and graduate work in bioengineering at Virginia Tech. While at Tech, he also interned at Roanoke Memorial Hospital, and prior to Lehigh, he taught at Lafayette, hold your booze, for 14 years.
Seen the light that come across.
And then at the University of London for 4 years. His scholarship revolves around the ethical and social implications of technology, with a primary focus on engineering disasters. He's also developed courses in the ethics for RCES and IDEAS. Gordon Bearn has taught philosophy at Lehigh since the late 20th century. His philosophical heroes are, in order, Whitehead, Wittgenstein, Derrida, Deleuze, and Foucault. Although philosophy has a reputation for attempting to track truth along narrow field of logic, he thinks that philosophy should draw us out of ourselves along languid lines of liquid corporeality, merging with sounds, merging with things. His favorite line is Gertrude Stein's, "Yes, that is the way I mean to please." His favorite way of spelling beautiful is becoming. Michael Gill is professor and chair of psychology at Lehigh University. He conducts research on the psychology of blame and punishment, with a particular focus on how to make blame a constructive rather than destructive force in social relations. He teaches courses on personality, psychology of morality, and psychology of evil. He enjoys hiking, mountain biking, reading, and spending time with his family and friends. So if everyone can just give a round of applause for So just to get right to it, we don't want to make any assumptions, so I just want to ask the panel in general, are there any ethical dilemmas people face when they accept job offers?
No.
I would kind of follow that with a statement in engineering ethics. We have to be very careful that something rises to the level of an ethical situation. There's a difference between, say, the ethics of cheating on homework and the ethics of launching a space shuttle that kills 7 people. And so I think that is where, in a lot of this comes in. Does it rise to the level of an ethical situation? And I'm not so sure it always does. I don't necessarily, I think it's more of a professional problem than an ethical problem.
I think maybe, so I can just start with an autobiographical note, which is, again, you had mentioned I'm from the US Naval Academy, which is a really different institution. And so I grew up in a very liberal bastion of both Connecticut and Bangladesh, strange combination, but I was always sort of taught a little bit implicitly that the military is just not that great, right? Just sort of an aura of like, you shouldn't partake in that. So there was a little bit of a hesitation when I, joined the institution, but mainly it was more about, the mundane issues of like, how many classes am I going to be teaching, and is there a research budget, and those sorts of things. And it was only after joining the institution that I ultimately started to grapple with these things that I didn't know about. The problems regarding creation of maybe, button pushers as opposed to actual critical thinkers. And I thought maybe the stakes are a little bit high. I'd rather be teaching kids to know why they're pushing the button and make sure that they don't push the wrong button, because if you do that, maybe some bad things will happen to the planet. And so it became, okay, I don't know about this objective of this institution, but I grappled within. I know maybe we'll talk later about maybe trying to reform a place from inside. I gave it a shot. I tried to kind of inject sort of this sort of critical thinking. And after a decade or more of doing that, how did it go? I'm here, so that tells you something about that.
It went.
I didn't make, it was not as dramatic a change as going from Lafayette to here, but nevertheless, it was. I think it was worthwhile endeavor. But one has to be just very clear-eyed in terms of what someone, an individual institution can affect and what they cannot affect, and that's something that all of you will figure out soon enough when you're in your particular paths.
So I'd like to follow up on some of those points, which is I think the ethical dimensions of what we do professionally, I think often become clearer to us after we spend some time in a certain profession and we're first choosing a job or just happy to have something to do that pays us, and so on. And for a lot of the job choices we might make, there's not any massive ethical dilemmas involved. But I'll share a story about a friend of mine who got fed up with the ethical unsatisfactoriness of what she was doing for a living. So she went to law school and became a lawyer, and then her original goal was to do something relating to the law and improving justice in society and equality in society and so on. But like a lot of people, she ended up being a corporate lobbyist and spent her time in Washington D.C. Arguing for certain concessions to be made for the kinds of corporations that she worked for, right? Try to bend regulations so that would benefit the business she worked for. She, over time, felt more and more uncomfortable with that use of her life and her skills and so on. And she said it was literally killing her. She said her blood pressure was high and she just felt unhealthy and she couldn't sleep and had a lot of stress because of these kind of ethical problems she had. And she ultimately decided to quit her job. And she was a prudent person, so while she was making tons of money as a lawyer, she saved up a lot of this money. So she ended up leaving the practice of law, going back to school, getting a graduate degree in leadership, I think at Georgetown, which is one of the top leadership schools in the country. And now she runs her own business, training people to do mindful leadership. And that taps into her values much more, and she's a much happier person now. So I think it doesn't rise to the level of people dying in a space shuttle accident, but it's a kind of everyday ethical problem we can face in our job. Like, am I spending my life the way I want to spend my life? Am I doing the things in my society that I want to be doing in my society? And you know, I guess one irony is it's because she made so much money doing this thing she didn't like that she could quit, take a few years off, go back to school and get a degree to do something that was more ethically meaningful and appropriate to her. So there's always these kinds of paradoxes where, you know, the thing she was uncomfortable with actually paved the way for her to do what she is doing today.
I know nothing about getting a job outside of academia, but I did once have a roommate who was in Yale's School of Management, and at that time, in the late 20th century, Yale was giving out degrees in something they called Masters in Public and Private Management. The idea was that you would apply to this school rather than to some other school. I don't even know how you differentiate these business schools, but this school was meant to be, if you wanted to work for a nonprofit, you would get training in non-profiteering, or if like you wanted to work for a museum or like I don't know, maybe a waterworks in some small town or something like that, this would help you with that. And what my roommate noticed, he was one of these I want to work for a sewage system people, and he noticed that willy-nilly everybody learned that the plum jobs, the jobs that the teachers all said, that's a good job, and your student friends said, that's a good job, were all in the financial world. And all the best students arrived wanting to work, you know, in a nonprofit and ended up bragging about their jobs at investment banks. And I don't, that to me seems something that is a shame, because this university, trying hard not to do that, ended up somehow doing that anyway. And what that meant was that not all, because obviously some people want to work in banks, some people want to make bombs, that's a different story. But like, if you didn't want to do that, what happened to your friend happened to all these good-hearted people just because, I don't know, the salaries were higher, they had more cachet, and what I think the ethical issue there is that the school taught people the value of prestige, and they went for prestige rather than what they cared about, and they lost control of their lives by going for prestige. And I think that you know, I know 7 people dying in the shuttle's a bad thing, but like everybody in a college doing what they don't want to do is also an existential problem. So that's my only experiences with that, and so that's kind of what it happens in all fields, of course. Often it's the more technical, mathematical parts of the field that have the cachet, it happens in universities. The more technical, mathematical parts of the university have the cachet, and if your thing is reading James Joyce, the fact that that's difficult, that doesn't count for anything because it's a waste of time, and where's the math?
Well, thank you. I've been here for 17 years, and I didn't know I had cachet. If I could just add one personal story that follows up on all of that, and it's very personal, it happened to me. My first job out of college was in the nuclear industry, and I was a pipe stress, pipe support engineer, finite element analysis, modeling, very dull, but it was okay. At the end of the first year, I got called in with my entire group, and the company president said, here's the deal. This division is being spun off. We're being sold to an organization that wants to use our nuclear expertise to design the next generation of nuclear weapons. And so I got in there because I wanted to be a mechanical engineer. I loved mechanics. And all of a sudden, I was being asked to do something that personally violated my personal ethical code. And it put me in it didn't put me in a tough situation, but the tough situation that arose from this was, for me, I quit. I mean, I couldn't do it, but it was very easy for me to be noble and, you know, make this grand gesture that I'm quitting on great ethical grounds, but I was going to quit anyway. I had a great fellowship to go back to graduate school. And so I just did that. But and I want you to think about this, my office mate was 53 years old. He had a wife, he had 3 kids, he had 2 cars, and a mortgage. He was even more anti-nuclear weapons than I was. But he really didn't have a choice. He had, I mean, the choice was a lot different for him than it was for me. And that, I think, rises, as I say, in engineering ethics, a very small subset, but that, I think, rises to a level of, there are some ethical issues there.
So the next question I want to ask, so there's kind of multiple parts for engineers. There are examples like what you're talking about, Professor Best. There's stuff in the business space. There's also stuff like political consulting, kind of like all the different stuff we talk about, kind of check all the different boxes. But when people make those decisions, what sort of things should they consider? And I know what was also brought up in the intro is the idea of not only making the decision to start working, but the decision to continue working is something important. So if you wouldn't mind maybe talking about some of the things to consider, maybe if you were in those situations for your personal ethics, but also just in an abstract way.
I can start off as an engineer.
Yeah.
We have a very strict code of ethics that we are supposed to adhere to when you become an engineer. And it's, I think, more rigorous than the Hippocratic Oath. And it says, point blank, and this is where we have some ethical conundrums in engineering, is our #1 priority is to guarantee, above all else, the safety of the public. And that's our #1 responsibility. And that can, in job responsibilities, that can put people in some very serious, but I think that does rise to a level of an ethical situation. And it's so often that is lost, and in my field, that's why we have engineering disasters. If you look at them all, it's because people are not putting the safety of the public first.
So I would think about this from, I have to remember what it was like to be in your shoes, and to be young and idealistic. And many of you, I think, in some respects, are about as idealistic as you are ever going to be, right? And so that is an important thing. It's a power, actually, and I think, it's a great thing to be able to be idealistic, to think about the world, to try to make it a better place, and to act on it. The rub, I think, in some ways, is that you are also about as clueless as you are from now into the rest of your life, until I guess
that the nicest
I mean the nicest, unfortunately, until like dementia sets in or whatever. But I mean, ultimately, this is where so you have the idealism, but the experience is lacking, right? And so that's the rub. And so sort of this weird trade-off, where as you get more and more experience, you sort of know about the world and you get to learn about it, and you say, oh, these are the ethical landscapes and these are the minefields that I need to avoid. But it's potentially possible that your idealism starts to wane right away with every passing year, with every mortgage payment that you have to make, with every kid that you have to feed. And suddenly your politics, as Gandhi used to say, if your politics are confined to bread, then you are really confined, right, in terms of what you can do. Your agency has been taken away in a major manner. To me, that is one of these fundamental dilemmas that exist, that by the time you are ready to know of learning about the ethical problems. Right now, I think people have a great notion, but it does take some time, and it takes time to actually involve yourself into these particular institutions. I think whether it's politics, whether it's the military, or dealing with something that might actually end up causing great harm to people. There's always going to be that flip side, right? But it really takes a lot of context, at least from my perspective, to learn what those pitfalls are. So again, I would just come back to this idea of right now, when you're joining an organization or an institution, join it, check it out, learn about it, and first see if your ethical kind of things that you were worried about in the first place actually meet the reality of the situation. And then if it does, see if one can affect change from within. Maybe it's a bit of a, despite my sad autobiography, I think it is possible, right, to do precisely that. But you sort of have to know where the problems are in the first place, and that does take some time. So I know maybe it's not a message that people want to hear, but sometimes patience is going to be important?
Well, I challenge this. Some people in the audience will laugh tremendously at this. Don't fall off your chair, Dan. I am very melodramatic, very theatrical. I'm also very naive and idealistic in how I teach ethics. To me, one of the great metaphors of what you were saying is the picture of, and I have it at home, it's a photograph I have over my desk at home, and it's of the guy in Tiananmen Square with his hand against the tank. And I want engineers to be that guy. I want engineers to take that. I want them to be naive. I want them to be idealistic, because I think you can survive in the professional world. And the reason why I say that is, my first job as an engineer, we thought there was somebody in our office forging documents to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. But actually, this young engineer that I know that was involved in this, first year out of college, making a boatload of money. He didn't want to be a think, he didn't want to be fired, so this young engineer didn't do anything. You know who that young engineer was? That young engineer was me. 41 years later, hard to believe, 41 years after that incident, I still remember it and I still feel guilty because I did not do my ethical responsibility to protect the safety of the public. And I know it's naive, it's idealistic, but there is place in this world for naive idealism.
Whatever happened to that guy, by the way? Who stopped the tank in China?
And the revolution.
I mean, I wouldn't want to wish that on any of them.
But there comes a point, though, where there needs to be people like that. There needs to be people that say, enough is enough. And in engineering ethics, I mean, we see over and over again, engineers don't do that, and you end up having hundreds of thousands of people being affected by the Bhopal chemical leak that could have been stopped. Had one engineer said, and again, I agree with you. I mean, it's a darn hard thing to do. But I think it needs to be at least considered, at least thought of.
I'll say the ethical considerations in psychology are different than that. We're generally not poisoning people or creating vehicles that might explode upon takeoff. But the kind of guiding ethical principle of psychology is to alleviate the suffering of people, right, and to improve the well-being of people, right. And psychologists do that by providing therapy for people who are suffering from mental illness, but also doing things like improving educational interventions so students can learn better. Students who are struggling to learn can learn better. Psychologists do things like try to, reduce racism, reduce hostility between different groups in society, and so on. So there's a large focus on, alleviating human suffering and improving human well-being. And I think the consideration, and I think this is kind of what your question is about, like what should people think about as they enter the field in terms of ethics, I think is, think about where you fit into that process of improving human well-being, right? And I think for somebody entering the field of psychology, one major distinction is, are you a person who's going to be out there face-to-face with people who are suffering, and are you going to be trying to help them directly, right? So that's one kind of role you can be in as a psychologist, or are you going to be like me, who does research on topics, and as a researcher, what I try to do is investigate what are the best ways to help people, right? If we want to help people, if we want to improve marriages or reduce racism or whatever we want to do to improve the human condition, what's the most effective way to do that, right? And that's why we do research, is to identify what's actually effective. And I think you could, view either of those things as being an ethical choice, right? Like kind of being on the front lines and intervening to improve people's lives, or being in the background as a researcher trying to inform what people are doing out there in the real world. And, I'd say for me, I decided to choose the path I chose because personality-wise, I'm just not an activist, right? I'm a person who is, I may want to solve a problem, but I'm going to think, how should I solve this problem, right? I don't know what to do. What's the best way to do it, right? So I'm kind of slow to spring into action. Right, and all the people I know who are activists are fast to spring into action, right? They often, to me, spring into action before they even know what they're doing, right? And some of them, again, I won't name names, are a little bit unqualified to do the kinds of things that they're doing, and I wonder if they're actually effective in trying to produce the changes they want to produce. So yeah, I kind of question the ethics of that, right? Running into situations where there is human suffering to be alleviated, but running into those situations without a clear idea of what the best way to help is in that situation. So I think those are the considerations of doing psychology. And for me, the best people who are kind of activists on the front line trying to improve people's lives also regularly engage with the scientific literature, regularly take classes and so on to try to ensure that they really know the best evidence-based ways to improve people's lives.
It looks like I meant to talk about ethical things in philosophy. I think for me, I guess that's what I'm talking for, I think the ethical question is whether to teach about the significance of our existence or to teach the technicalities of various philosophical views. It's a difference between teaching something that is very easy to test and teaching something that you have no idea whether you're talking nonsense all the time. And so I think that is what I think is the ethical thing. And the easy path, well, it's not easy because it's technical, but the easy path is to professionalize yourself. And I'm more or less, and so professional philosophers always say, doesn't it drive you crazy that they shelve the philosophy books right next to the self-help books? And my feeling is like, when philosophy stops being self-help, it has stopped being philosophy. And so that's the ethical thing. I have two things that are just like in responses. I feel like we should not swallow too easily that experience conservativizes. I think we should ask ourselves, what is it about experience that makes us conservative? And it seems to me like one first shot would be like getting involved in an institutional setup or project makes one care about the project independently of whether or not the project is good. And so no wonder if that's what you're doing, you become more conservative. And I also think that, and so we should, and it seems to me like the training, ethical training in especially a college like an engineering college or a business college, it seems to me should be less about codes of ethics and more about how to maintain your soul when you take your first job. And it's also another thing that these comments have made me think is like not doing any harm. Well, the Socratic one is do no harm and always, being good to people. I think one question, which is naive, of course, is like, which people? Like, we have an engineering college that is focused on getting people jobs in the industrialized world. I assume there's some people who do engineering for the global south. Why do we have an engineering college that focuses on one part of the world and not the other? Like, is it because the salaries are better? Is that a good ethical decision? Like, I do want to do no harm, but I want to do no harm to Americans. That seems to be, like, that's odd. Understandable, it's the way, and French engineers are the same thing. They want their nuclear power plants for French people. But that doesn't make it right. And so it seems to me like we should think about whether the engineering curriculum at, more or less roughly the United States is designed to serve the interests of this particular global power and not to serve the good of whatever that code of ethics was.
Interesting point you bring up, and since this is Douglas Dialogues, I could, disagree with one of my colleagues. I disagree slightly with what you said about how psychologists think, because that's how engineers think, or that's how we're supposed to think. My wife
I didn't say you guys didn't think that.
Right. My wife has an app on her phone that she can turn the oven on and off. She can up the temperature. She can do all of this stuff on her phone. Engineers spend emotional, economic, engineering capital doing that. But yet, we don't have access to clean drinking water in Cancer Alley in Louisiana. And this is, again, where I tend to be naive and idealistic, is I think, Gordon, that that's what we should be teaching our engineers.
We're on the same page.
That we should be teaching our engineers. You know, and also, the thing is, in an ethical situation, is one of the case studies that I've studied in real depth is the Bhopal chemical leak. It killed thousands of people in Bhopal. There was an exact same sister plant in a town called Institute, West Virginia, that was designed differently. It had an evacuation plan. It had money for capital improvements. It had money to train engineers better. Why? Union Carbide was an American company. It was in America. And I think that, and again, a lot of you have heard me get up on my soapbox about this quite often, is I think that is an ethical part of the job. I think we have a responsibility to teach students, at least to give them the opportunity to go work in fields like that.
Can I just very quickly just jump in? Just in the spirit of not disagreeing, just a different perspective, maybe on this idea of experience. And what does experience do in terms of, is it a natural evolution of conservatism, right? Just become more conservative. So 2 points. One is I wonder about this idea of joining an institution that is inherently corrupting of the individual, right? The soul kind of sucking kind of jobs that I think maybe some of us are envisioning and trying to desperately to avoid. We just want to know what those are. But I wonder, I mean that is sort of a little bit of a presumption of the fragility of us, that we wouldn't be able to maintain that we're keeping our soul and our sort of ethics intact. And so I wonder, right, that's just sort of a different perspective in terms of, I certainly as an economist don't necessarily view the world, though I've had some miserable jobs that have actually led me to this is a nice gig, and so I don't know what a real job is really actually at some, but what I think is important to acknowledge the fact that sometimes those experiences can strengthen, like the anti-fragile idea that sometimes we've heard about, rather than kind of break us down and fall apart. The other component that I would quickly add is, and I'm not here to defend investment bankers. That's not, even though they're good, they can be good folks. But having experience in the iBanking world, having experience in the military world, having experience in the academic world, I can tell you that I wouldn't call it conservatism. I would call it just a destruction of all my preconceived thoughts that I had in those idealistic, youthful times that I had. And I say that because actually I recently went back to the house in Connecticut and I found my old journals from college. And 2 things were very striking to me when I read them. 1, man, this guy cares about stuff. Interested, right? Really fired up about these various things. And 2, this guy is an idiot. Doesn't really understand the basic ideas, and I'm not calling anyone, this is me going back, but what I would recommend possibly is tonight, start a journal. You blog, or whatever it is that you do that documents your thoughts, and then keep it handy, read it in 5 years, 10 years, I think you would be absolutely amazed, both at the spirit of your passion and drive, and you should kind of try to preserve that, but also just how, maybe off the mark, you were, and it really did take a certain degree of labor experience to appreciate. So I think it's a little differently in terms of conservatism, but there's an evolution, that is to be sure.
I think I don't really disagree. What I really meant was that getting involved in a bureaucratic system makes you care about instrumental things within that system, and instrumental thinking gets in the way of being decent. And that's what I mean.
My grandmother always said that if you're not a radical under 30, you should have your heart examined. If you are a radical over 30, you should have your head examined.
But that's like giving up. Like if you're not a radical when you're older, when you've got the knowledge that you say you don't have, I also think like the knowledge that you gain is often, well, that won't work. I don't think so. And in our university, people say to the administration, something systemically is off here, and the administration always says, well, what particularly would you like to change? Thus killing the whole problem of the systemic problem. And when you get older, what you learn is you need to have something practical to do. And it's not, what practical means, like keeping Lehigh the same kind of, but maybe a little better, but maybe it's still, well, I don't know.
But I think you hit it kind of on the head a little bit when it comes to, it seems like academics in particular have this bias towards inaction. We are sort of suffering this paralysis, but I think maybe it's simply a curse of knowing too much, of having that kind of experience of being like, that won't work, this won't work. I'm not sure what will work.
It's hard
All
to
I
know
know
what
is a
works.
lot of things don't work.
A lot of things don't, yeah.
Also, but there's a conflict of interest when somebody in a powerful position says, I know I'm on your side, but I don't think that would work. I'm on your side. I really, Lehigh needs to have a better sort of diverse situation, but that won't work. That's just, I don't know, we think about conflicts of interest when it's somebody marketing pharmaceuticals, but there's conflicts of interest when somebody is in a powerful position in an institution facing people who want it to be better, because they say, well, the institution would have to change. Yeah.
All right, so we just have one more question before we kind of open up the Q&A. So once someone does accept a job that they're kind of uncomfortable with, whether it's making weapons, green environment, even busting, there are particular reasons we've heard people use to justify these decisions. So for example, it's only part of the company, not the part I'm working at, or someone else going to take the job anyway, so me personally taking this role isn't that bad. Or, like Professor Rahman's mentioned, I can lead change from the inside. So I'm wondering what you guys think of these arguments and if they're reasonable.
I think the argument of working on change from the inside could also be an ethical obligation of an engineer. I firmly believe that. You can satisfy your professional obligation, still satisfy your ethical obligation as an engineer, and make change from within. I don't buy the argument that, well, if I wouldn't do it, they'd find somebody else. I get very concerned about that, and I guess the idealist in me would say, but if enough people wouldn't take the job because of that, there's not going to be enough people that they could find to substitute for them.
Or the salary would go way up.
Or the salary would go way up to do it. And so, but no, I think making change from within, I think whether it's doable, I think that depends upon the company and the structure of the company. But I think it's doable.
I'll take that. I'll see that and raise you. What do we think of the idea, if you have democratic ideas, tendencies, beliefs, join the Republican Party. If you're a Republican, join the Democratic Party. If you're a pacifist, join the military. If you want to abolish the Second Amendment, join the NRA. These are the kinds of things that people don't usually, it's like that's very counterintuitive. But if you take it to the point of you really want to affect change, I think that, again, it accomplishes two things. One is you get to see the belly of the beast. You get to see exactly what's going on. Is it as bad as you think it is? Are these people as nutso as they seem to be on their soapboxes? Maybe, maybe not, right? And then the next step is, can you change it? Now, if you cannot, and I think this is definitely a situation where, this is a moving machine and I'm just a cog in it and I really can't do it, then yeah, you have an obligation then to find what your skill sets are that match as best and that is consistent with your ethics. As a labor economist, I then have to stress the fact that we really need lots of labor mobility. We need the opportunity, right? So that's sort of a pie, like a bird's eye view of, in order to be able to match, you need to shop around for the different jobs, and you're going to find one that maybe is going to be fitting yours, sort of background and skill sets and so on. But it does require a certain degree of that mobility, which requires certain things like maybe deregulation or lowering barriers to entry, and those are the kinds of things that might create other problems, right? And so let's just be a little bit clear-eyed about what is necessary to have people that join jobs that they are, they're satisfied both in terms of their lifestyle, in terms of their income, and in terms of their ethics. But that's sort of, so that I think that's an important consideration. And if you think that's an important thing, then we should be saddened the fact that labor and geographic mobility amongst people is sort of at an all-time low. It's about as low as it's ever been since we've been measuring these sorts of things. And so that usually doesn't come up, but yeah, it actually can create problems, and people are sort of then quote-unquote stuck in places that they don't feel fulfilled at, and really are then sort of trapped, and that's something we want to avoid. That just killed everything.
Well,
That's the answer.
I like what you said about you make a change and then there are more problems that come. I think one of the things that people that want to do something face is that in the face of a suggestion which has good idea written on it, the people who are opposing it say, well, that'll cause these problems. And I think we should learn to say, it is a good thing to do. New problems will occur. We'll deal with those when they arrive, and it's not like it's not like the change has to be one that flattens all the problems. Like if there's a modest problem that could be fixed in a modest way, which causes other problems, I think that we just have to learn to say, those are new problems. I mean, you need to be hyper vigilant, but you don't need to wait for the answer to them all.
Yeah, our profession's about benefits and costs, right? Just weighing them, and so part of the cost should be there could be these ancillary spillovers that are negative.
Yeah.
What are they? And then you just do a actual okay, this one's bigger than this, and so we're going to either move in this direction or in the other direction.
And some of those it is. I mean, I don't really believe in ethics, but it's one of those things that we have sort of an obligation to deal with. Like ending slavery caused a lot of problems, but it doesn't seem like, well, there's a lot of problems, we better not do that. Like that. Some problems you have to buy.
Yeah.
And in my field, we call that the revenge of unintended consequences.
Oh, it's a revenge.
Yep, the revenge of unintended consequences. That we do something. AstroTurf is a great example. The number of knee injuries because of AstroTurf, people getting their foot caught in the act, they never considered that.
That was a terrible move, by the way.
It was, it's just the revenge of unintended consequences.
Yep.
The other thing from an ethical perspective that you said that I will go a step further is I think we also, in technological development, we need to start thinking like a chess player, a couple moves ahead, and kind of trying to think about what problems may come from the next technology. I mean, why do we wait until we have a problem before we start to solve that problem? I did a lot of work early on, a lot of study on Dolly the sheep and genetic and cloning and all this stuff. And it wasn't until Dolly the sheep was proven that it would work, that they could do it, that the scientists, the bioengineers said, ooh, we really want to do that with humans? They've had, in my classes, pardon my language, but we call that the Charlotte Best oh shit moment. You get to a point where you just say, uh-oh, we got a problem. And we never even thought about it. And to me, that's an ethical obligation, is can we think about them all? No. Will we achieve them all? No. But I also go back, again, follow up on something that Gordon said, is it's a process. And we need to relish, the process is more important to me than anything else. It's this process of technological development.
All right, with that, we're just going to open up the Q&A. So anyone?
Ben, I saw your hand first.
So we spent a lot of time talking about the negative side of the situation where, unfortunately, you enter your first job and it's wildly against your ethical codes. Of course, there's a positive situation, which is great, probably not much to talk about. But there's also the situation where somewhere in the middle, it's neither entirely against, but also not completely for. So in one of those situations, does someone have an ethical responsibility to find a job within that area, but which maximizes, to a reasonable extent, the impact of their own values or the ethical values? Put it in like an engineering example, you could be making AstroTurf, not nuclear weapons, but you could be making whatever
Vaccine.
comes to mind. It's vaccine, exactly.
Right.
Should people always seek out that maximum?
So, good question. I would have to, so I feel compelled to mention Adam Smith, but I'm not going to talk about The Wealth of Nations, and rather I'm going to talk about the sister and possibly more important work, Theory of Moral Sentiments. And he had actually
considered his best.
Yeah, which, okay, depends on who you talk to, but yes, that's right. Kind of dealing with this in the context of, grievances, so basically, is it lack of benevolence? Not, so the world can live in a beneficent manner. It could be cruel, it could be harsh. But justice is a different story. If the world is unjust, it cannot stand. That's something that comes up in the Theory of Moral Sentiments all the time. So I think about that in the context of then your job and weighing those things, right? There's a lot of gray. And so I think one thing one can think about is what level of severity are we talking about here? Are we talking about unjust things that this corporation or this institution is actually imposing on people? Or is it simply, it's not cool, it's not nice, it's not, but it's a little bit of rough and tumble. Does it elevate to the point of fraud? Nassim Taleb, I think I would call him the modern day Stoic philosopher. Is that something that my philosophy?
Yep.
Is that okay? Okay, cool. So he has wonderful aphorisms. One of them is basically, if you see fraud, but do not say fraud, you are a fraud, right? That's a great, right, exactly. And so it's a wonderful it's kind of hard, but yeah, hit the aphorism. The problem is most things of malfeasance rarely rise to the level of fraud. That's kind of high, right? Most things are a little bit more what you're talking about. A lot of these gray areas, a lot of these, so I guess so I would say, yeah, there are some guideposts to actually think, to guide your thinking in terms of what kind of ethical quandary you yourself are in. But, so again, many people have written about this, and I would just say it's up to all of us to kind of understand those guideposts and kind of like when you see that malfeasance rise to a level where this is just not acceptable, right? But that's a little bit, that's a big judgment for each of us to do that.
I'll kind of answer that from my perspective. I'm annoying, but I'm consistent. My wife says I'm consistently annoying. That's another issue. I think to a point, especially with what we have in the world, I think we do have an obligation as engineers, and I do think it can potentially rise to an ethical obligation to do things for the social good, to do things to solve problems that need to be solved. I don't think everybody can do that. I guess I expect people to at least consider that possibility. That, I think, is your ethical obligation. Ethical obligation, you go work for a company that's going to manufacture oven apps for, my wife's new oven, or developing technology to give access to clean water. I kind of think that we should at least engage in a discussion or a debate about that. I think as an engineer, I think we do have certain ethical obligations towards doing things for the social good.
And I'll just chime in and say, your question actually points right to the heart of one of the major kind of points of ethical disagreement among people. And so there's one ethical perspective that says our only obligation to other people is to not hurt them, right? And so you said your neutral job, you wouldn't be hurting people, so from that ethical perspective, what you're doing is perfectly fine, right? But from another perspective, we have an obligation to provide benefits to other people, if it's within our power and we don't have to kill ourselves to do it, and so on and so forth. And so your question is basically, which one of those viewpoints is right? And I'd say you have to decide for yourself, right? I don't think there's a knockdown argument for one over the other, although we each have strong intuitions about them. Like, I feel like doing something for the public good is my obligation, right? But
you won't be shocked to learn that economists will feel slightly different.
exactly.
That it's each and ourselves, but again, there is something, and again, it can be
Don't hurt people,
demonic.
but-
Don't hurt people.
But make lots of money in
Well,
the
makes
process.
lots of money, and then the
Maximize your
process,
own welfare.
the whole society benefits, then that whole spiel. You can buy it, you cannot buy it. or something along those lines. Yes.
Which is not entirely false.
All right, so we'll move to the next question. Could I have your name?
I'm Sasha.
Sasha, go ahead.
So as someone who's primarily studying like computer science, and I'm kind of in like the phase where we're looking for internships and things like that, there's a really big push and I guess emphasis on like these big tech companies, whether it's Google, Facebook, Amazon, etc. And those are kind of like the most easy to apply to and kind of most like prestigious opportunities that can kind of be, it can be good to have on your resume, like, oh, I interned at SpaceX or whatever. But at the same time, it is very kind of large. I could go on and on about the many ethical feats of disgust that these companies have done. So kind of, do you have any suggestions for people kind of like me who are kind of in this position where most of the opportunity is available, or the ones that are kind of like would be helpful to me are ones like in grounds that I wouldn't ethically support? That makes sense.
Google's models do no evil, right? Or it was.
It was.
Well, maybe that's the problem. Oh, that's a little bit too ambitious for us.
And yet they created algorithms that made 14-year-old girls dependent upon their technology.
There's that.
From a professional basis, and again, this is something that comes with experience. You could, and it might take a lot of work, you could probably find the same amount of work, opportunities, this better fulfillment with other companies. I had a student in Ideas many years ago who all he wanted to do was work for Disney. He wanted to be an Imagineer. All he wanted to do his whole life. And he went through Ideas, and junior year basically was told by Disney, nah, we don't have any jobs for you. He found a French manufacturer of carnival rides, of roller coasters, that offered him a job. And he went to them and he said, a year later I talked to him, he said, you know, I'm doing the same kind of stuff that I probably would have been doing at Disney, but I don't have the crap that goes along with trying to work for Disney and all of the problems that they have. My feeling is in coding, yeah, Google might be what we strive for, but I think there are other opportunities. I think there are other options. And so I think you can look at those, and I think you can combine the best of both.
And I'll just reiterate something you said, I think you said, which is you just have to work harder to find those other opportunities, right? It's the huge companies with lots of resources are going to, make themselves available, for you to apply to them and so on. There's much more recruiting going on and so on. So it'll take a lot more work on your part if you want to find a position that really fits with your values.
And you have to give up people saying you work at Google. And for some people that's hard because we've worked in school. It's like you got an A, so we're all about that and
prestige.
Yeah, and that's a lot to give up, especially if we've been trained for our entire education to go for the highest mark in the class.
But as an economist, I would also say that you need a lot of choice. You need a market, the robust growth, and all that stuff in order to have the ability, the wherewithal to kind of figure out these things. And so we shouldn't be that thrilled to now stats say, well, there's like a 100% chance of recession. I saw 100%. I'm not 100% sure of this, of anything, but 100% chance of recession over the next 12 months. That should be alarming. And especially in the context of this discussion.
God bless America.
I'm here to just sprinkle cheer.
Comment, yeah, go ahead.
I kind of think like we need those idealistic people like to take those jobs, because if we just get the same types of people to perpetuate the same energy that isn't Google or these big companies that we don't like or don't think is ethical, how will it ever change? Like, if we just look for these first ethical jobs. So I guess my question is like, how do you feel about working within systems to put yourself in a position to do ethical goods later on?
I think one important aspect there is that this is where the discussion of diversity matters a lot. When we talk about diversity of very particular things, but diversity of backgrounds, diversity of perspective, diversity of these sorts of things where you're absolutely right. It will, if you have a company that simply has monolithic kind of approach of hiring, you're going to end up with the same kind of approach year upon year upon year. And so I think there is a very important argument that whatever you feel about the discussion of diversity, inclusion, and equity, that there are huge benefits. Maybe we're not measuring diversity in the right way, maybe we are, but that whole perspective, that's where the organizations need to take that, and they are taking it very seriously, I believe, in part for their own, their own salvation, in order to have those different perspectives to kind of say, again, that this wasn't cool what we were doing before, and now that we have fresh blood, we'll be able to kind of navigate this terrain a little better.
But is it real diversity if everybody in the company thinks the same? Like, I feel
I don't
like
think
now
so.
in society we're pushing this like superficial diversity, like, oh, we got different colors of people or races or religions or whatever, but everybody in the room thinks the same. So like,
Well, now we're talking.
how is
Really
that
good.
ever going to
I
like,
don't like-
any like system?
Yeah.
or
You
institution?
bring up a fascinating point. Many years ago, I was doing a research project with a student on the decision to launch Challenger and all of the effects. And we were very lucky that we could interview Dr. Sally Rye. And the student sat across the table from her and said, Dr. Rye, can I ask you a very pointed question? And she said, sure, I know what you're doing, and ask me anything. And the student looked at her and said, do you think the decision to launch Challenger would have been any different had the decision-making process not been made up of 100%, and he pointed at me. If you look at the pictures in Challenger of mission control, what do you see?
White man.
You see all upper middle class white dudes like me, with the only difference is, this was back in the 80s, they had pocket protectors, okay? I don't know if you know what pocket protectors are. I might be dating myself. And she looked at me and she said, to both of us, and she said, guys, here's my point. I'd like to think so, but I'm not so sure. And the student said, why? And her response was, because by the time you get to be a management personnel in a technical company, you're not thinking like an engineer. You're not thinking like a diverse group of people. You're all coming together to think in one voice, in one view. And that's the problem. Bayer Leverkusen had this problem with the E-Shore. All of the decision makers in the E-Shore were men. There were no women involved in making the decision. And I think where your question takes me, and I think it's a brilliant question, is how can we increase diversity, equity, inclusion without people losing their own self-identity in a corporation? And I think that's an important issue. Do we lose who we are? Do we become, a corporate person and not Bill Best anymore?
Well, this is just what your question was about. It's like you could have superficial diversity, but everybody has the same sort of set of things that they care about. And what Bill's suggesting is that that happens as you move up. So the chance of somebody at the top still wanting to change everything to make it better is basically zero. If the way to get to the top is to stop being a troublemaker, then, another way of putting this is working from within to make change I think the changes will be small because you have to work from within. So that basically means you can't blow it up. It has to survive. And if there's something big enough wrong with the deal, with the industry or something, then it's superficial improvement. Anyway, I don't do anything. I sit and read books, but it just seems like if you're
God, I want your job.
if you're working from within a thing, then one thing you can't do is blow it up, and it might need to be. I don't know.
Well, there for the engineers in the room, my example of momentum. The only way you can change momentum is with an impulse, and an impulse is a force times a time. You have a small force over a large period of time. This is what you just talked about. It takes a long time, but you might be able to change momentum. The other thing is you have an incredibly large force over a very small time, and in my field we call that an engineering disaster. And maybe we need an engineering disaster. Also following up on something you said, and you would know more about this than I would, because I'm not an economist and I don't play one on TV or anything. My sense is, especially in the engineering field, that corporations put an awful lot of pressure on the lower levels to tell the people above them what they want to hear and not what they need to know.
That's not crazy.
Okay. All right. So,
And and again, it's sort of like coming back to this idea. These institutions are really good at self-preserving, right? And in fact, in order to do that, and I come back to this idea of diversity, the superficial nature of some aspects of diversity might be problematic because these institutions know that very well. And so they will potentially satisfy particular requirements. They will potentially have on their web pages the pictures that you kind of want to see, and then you say, okay, it looks pretty good, you know? Those are the signals, but they can be superficial. But in the meantime, what they do is vet very carefully, very strongly, to get up to the next level, right? In order to get, and so you do, like they're saying this, and then maybe you can come here, and then maybe you can come here. But have you drunk the Kool-Aid, right? Are you touting the corporate line? So that is, I think, the ultimate challenge. I think it can be done. Again, this change from within story, but just keep that in mind that there are these countervailing forces, and that countervailing force is often your own institution trying to keep the way it's doing business. And so, change is possible, but let's be clear, it's hard. It's really hard.
Professor Gill, I didn't know.
I'm good. Thanks.
Good. All right. Well,
we're out of time. Yeah.
Yeah, we're out of time. Thank you for everyone for coming. Thank you to the professors. I know. Maybe we'll have to revisit this in the future. For the 5x10 people, we have the QR code that you have to fill out. Please fill it out like tonight, so I can send it to her.